Welcome to NNP Symposium, the October 2021 edition. We're getting kicked off this morning with Ernie Nagy, who's going to be speaking on the numismatics of British and American slavery abolition. This presentation reviews British and US metals and tokens used in the effort to abolish the slave trade and slavery itself. Ernie Nagy will explore the connections between historical events and numismatic objects produced as the events unfolded. We will also highlight the connections between the British tokens and metals and those produced in the US. Welcome, Ernie.
Thank you.
Want to go ahead? I see you got your video and audio enabled, so let's take it from there. Just a note to the audience. We will take questions at the end. You can enter those into the chat, and I will moderate and forward the questions to Ernie one at a time. All right, Ernie, if you want to get started, we'll take it from there.
Thanks. So I'm going to start with a kudos now rather than at the end of my program, so I don't forget, to the Newman Numismatic Portal Symposium for making available in the public domain a trove of information which has energized the study of connections between history and coins, currency, tokens, and metals. I know they have enthused me. This is a manila, or bracelet, a form of money used in Africa from the 15th to the 20th century. The piece I'm holding measures 60 by 54 millimeters, weighs 87 grams, and is made of leaded brass. Manillas of this dimension were made in Birmingham, England after 1860 and circulated in Nigeria as legal money through 1949. The manila pictured on this slide is from the British Museum's collection. Some were made in England, Portugal, France, and Holland for use in African trade as far back as 1420. Manillas were traded for commodities, including palm oil, pepper, and slaves. The ability of European traders to mass produce this form of money caused inflation. Portuguese trader Duarte Pacheco Pereira reported that in the 1490s, he purchased slaves at a price of between 12 and 15 manillas per slave. Fewer if they were made of copper, which was valued more. The books of the Portuguese ship São Miguel record that on June 25, 1522, the ship's pilot paid 50 manillas for the purchase of a 16-year-old female slave. Slavery existed for thousands of years in various forms in virtually all cultures. For an institution which survived over such a long time period, it is today remarkable that its demise, first across the British Empire and then in the United States, occurred during the relatively short time interval, beginning in the 1780s when a group of Quakers and Anglicans formed to oppose it, until 1865, when the United States Constitution was amended to abolish it. Of course, from the perspective of the slaves, the time was not so short. A good way to understand history is to recognize that with hindsight, we know how things turn out. Those involved at the time did not. I categorize historical metals in two groups. The first, those produced while history unfolds in an attempt to influence its outcome. The second, those issued after to commemorate an achievement. Some of the British metals in this story were instruments of their influence campaign. Others memorialized accomplishments. All of them were made prior to the end of slavery in the United States. All influenced the course of events culminating in the 13th Amendment. These designs, models, and legends are primary sources documenting the effort to end slavery. I've organized this presentation into 4 chapters. The first, British Abolition. Chapter 2 will cover some interim steps toward the abolition of slavery and British outreach to America. Chapter 3 is about women abolitionists, and the fourth chapter, Abolition in the United States. British leaders who were key to the abolition movement included former slave Equiano, author Thomas Clarkson, politician William Wilberforce, and craftsman Josiah Wedgwood. Tokens and medals document each of their legacies, as well as the campaign to end the slave trade and the abolishment of slavery itself. In May 1787, Clarkson was one of 12 men who met in a London bookstore and printing shop where they founded the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. Clarkson later arranged a dinner party to convince Wilberforce to join the abolition movement. Wilberforce was a member of the British Parliament who had previously read an anti-slavery Clarkson essay, which made a great impression on him. Before the passage of anti-slavery legislation could be achieved, a campaign to raise public awareness of the consequences of slavery was deployed. There's an old saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. The Abolition Society used an image of a kneeling slave surrounded by the words, "Am I not a man and a brother," is their emblem. Wedgwood would soon join the society and engage as senior craftsman William Hackwood to design a cameo medallion. The kneeling slave icon is the first widespread use of a logo to advocate for a cause and the forerunner to political campaign buttons. In 1788, Josiah Wedgwood sent a packet of his medallions to Ben Franklin, then president of the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery. In Franklin's reply to Wedgwood, he wrote, "I am persuaded the medallion may have an effect equal to that of the best written pamphlet in procuring favor to those oppressed people." This British provincial token, today called the Condor token, was produced by William Lutwidge from a die engraved by Charles James at a private mint in Birmingham, England. These were listed in the 1795 catalog of Thomas Spence. The kneeling slave device was also used on hat pins, snuff boxes, and other personal items. Similar copper tokens, some farthing, halfpenny, and penny size, have survived in higher rates than other objects on which the motto was used. We look at these tokens today as historical objects. When they were issued, they served a dual purpose. First, as coin substitutes, as the Royal Mint of King George, for some reason, did not produce copper coins from 1775 until 1797. And second, as part of the anti-slavery cause. I acquired this piece from Steve Hayden in 2018, purchased it from Eric Newman in 2016. The surfaces are an original light brown, showing slight evidence of use. I'll propose that Gustavus Vasa, who I'll refer to by his birth name Equiano, was a living example, or maybe the personification of, or even the inspiration for, the motto, "Am I not a man and a brother?" After purchasing his own freedom, he called on British abolitionists in 1774 to bring the Zong incident to light. The commander of the slave ship Zong ordered that 133 of the sickest Africans be thrown overboard, declaring there was insufficient drinking water for the crew. If they were sacrificed to save the crew, the loss would be covered by insurance. But if the Africans died of sickness or natural causes, the owners would absorb the loss. Equiano informed the abolitionists that the ship's records documented 200 gallons of water when the Africans were pitched into the ocean and 420 gallons when they arrived at their destination. In 1789, Equiano published his best-selling memoir describing his capture and enslavement as an 11-year-old in what is today Nigeria, his transportation across the Atlantic, his life as a slave in the West Indies and Virginia, his education, and how he was able to buy his freedom and settle in Great Britain. Equiano portrays himself as a gentleman and businessman, as sophisticated as any British citizen, as any man. The book made Equiano a relatively wealthy man. None of the numismatic articles and books on the Eminata man and brother tokens which I've come across reference Equiano as its likely inspiration. The relationship between Equiano and Wedgwood is evidenced by a 1788 letter written by Equiano to Josiah Wedgwood requesting permission to include Wedgwood as a subscriber to Equiano's book. This letter is today in the Wedgwood Museum. Joseph Gale, editor of the Sheffield, England Advisor, on August 27, 1790, made an observation citing Equiano by his slave named Gustavus Vasa, which is substantially in accordance with the legend Eminata man and a brother. He wrote, "Has not an African eyes, hands, organs, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt by the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a European? Should any within the circle of our readers doubt the truth of this comparison, let them see Gustavus Vasa, the free African, now in Sheffield, his manners polished, his mind enlightened, and in every respect on par with Europeans." The title page of Equiano's narrative, which I showed, I think it was 3 slides back, which depicted the Eminata man and brother emblem, is from a later edition. Those published during Equiano's lifetime did not include this logo. However, the archives of Howard University has conserved a handwritten inscription in an edition of Equiano's book dated November 11, 1796, while Equiano still lived, which concludes, "Remember the poor black. Is he not a man and your brother?" William Wilberforce came from a prosperous merchant family. He was a member of the House of Commons known for his speaking ability. He first introduced legislation to abolish the slave trade in 1791, failed to pass. Many members of Parliament had investments which would have suffered by its adoption. Wilberforce persisted, introducing abolition bills virtually every year. When he finally succeeded in 1807, he was celebrated with his 53mm bronze created by Thomas Webb. The reverse depicts seated Britannia, surrounded by Mercury, Prudence, and Justice. The goddess crowning Britannia from above is Victory. In 1840, Anti-Slavery Convention celebrated Thomas Clarkson by naming him president of the convention and its principal speaker. It also honored him with this medal bearing his portrait and a legend including the words, "President Thomas Clarkson, aged 81. Clarkson is widely recognized for his role in founding the society, his contributions as a pamphlet writer, and most important, for reporting on the horrors of slavery. Clarkson's research involved boarding ships, interviews of slave ship crew members, and collecting objects such as handcuffs, leg shackles, and thumb screws. Perhaps as iconic as the image of the kneeling slave was this diagram of the slave ship Brooks. Equiano, who had been a passenger on a similar ship, wrote a letter which appeared in a London newspaper on February 14, 1789, stating, "Having seen a plate representing the form in which Negroes are stowed on board the Guinea ships, which you are pleased to send to the Reverend Mr. Clarkson, a worthy friend of mine, I was filled with love and gratitude towards you for your humane interference on behalf of my oppressed countrymen." Clarkson reworked and expanded the diagram, which appeared in newspapers, magazine, books, pamphlets, and on broadsides. The objective of the British Am I Not a Man and Brother Condor token was achieved, at least from a legal perspective, on August 28, 1833, when an act for the abolition of slavery throughout the British colonies was passed by Parliament. This is commemorated on this medal portraying King William IV beneath a canopy surrounded by his advisors. The reverse depicts 7 Africans dancing around a freedom tree above the proclamation, "Slavery abolished by Great Britain." The act provided £20 million to former slave holders. Of the participants in this effort, craftsman Josiah Wedgwood died on January 3, 1795. Freed slave Equiano died on March 31, 1797, and politician William Wilberforce on July 29, 1833, 3 days after the Slavery Abolition Act was passed, but before it went into effect. Only Thomas Clarkson lived to see emancipation. The United States followed the path set by Great Britain by first outlawing the slave trade and then the establishment of a colony for freed slaves. Tokens and medals survive as artifacts of these parallels between British and American abolition. As previously mentioned, before the abolition of slavery itself, an act for the abolition of the slave trade was enacted by the British Parliament during March 1807. Clarkson, Wilberforce, and the British abolitionists would have abolished slavery itself if they had been able to do so. They could not. The abolition of the trade in slaves would have to suffice in 1807. The death rate on plantations was high, the result of poor nutrition, work conditions, brutality, and disease. Many plantation owners preferred to import new slaves rather than providing the conditions for the survival of their existing slaves. One saying, familiar to Caribbean plantation owners, was that it was better to buy than to breed. Work to death is today a cliche, but was then a result of a cruel cost-benefit calculation. If the abolitionists could not end slavery in 1807, elimination of the easy resupply of the slave pool was intended to improve their treatment. The British government then used Sierra Leone as a naval base from which its slave trade ban was enforced and as a center to which slaves captured in transit across the Atlantic were brought and freed. Freed Black slaves who had been liberated by the British from American slavery back during the Revolutionary War were initially settled in Nova Scotia. On March 11, 1792, an estimated 1,200 of these British Black loyalists were relocated to Sierra Leone. The number of slaves freed by the Royal Navy subsequent to 1807 would soon exceed the number from the original Nova Scotia resettlement. This Sierra Leone penny token announced slave trade abolished by Great Britain in 1807 to anyone who handled it, whether they spoke English or Arabic. On January 1, 1808, in the footsteps of the British Parliament's 1807 lead, the United States formally abolished the transatlantic slave trade at the earliest date allowed under the Constitution. Within a decade, the United States would also follow the British colonization plan and establish the colony of Liberia, located immediately south and east of Sierra Leone. This token was struck by the John Gibbs Company at Belleville, New Jersey, a firm which also produced hard times tokens from that period. These Liberian tokens were denominated 1 cent, dated 1833, and issued as a commemorative celebrating the American Colonization Society, founded 1816. The society's aim was to promote voluntary migration of freed slaves to West Africa. funds were provided by the Monroe administration to establish the colony of Liberia. By 1860, about 10,000 African Americans had been relocated there. This migration was relatively small in relation to the 4 million who remained in slavery in 1860. This medal has proof-like surfaces in provenance to the March 1985 Bowers and Marina auction of the FCC Boyd collection of anti-slavery tokens and medals, where it is described as rare in bronze and very rare as an unlisted white metal piece. After elimination of slavery across their empire, British abolitionists directed their efforts to places where slavery continued. The engraving of Voice from Great Britain to America in exurge beneath the Am I Not a Man and Brother Kneeling Slave make it the cornerstone and most important object in this collection. The motto is a specific connection between British and American abolition numismatics. Women played an important key role in the abolitionist movement in both Britain and the United States. The 1826 cover of the Report of the Female Society for the Relief of British Negro Slaves depicted the first kneeling female slave. Their founding members included Sarah Wedgwood, daughter of Josiah Wedgwood, whose pottery firm was instrumental in the creation of the British kneeling male slave emblem. Sarah likely utilized her connection to the Wedgwood firm to have the image redesigned. The Society's charter stated a deep and lasting compassion not only for the bodily sufferings of female slaves, but also for their moral degradation. The circumstances of enslaved women could be extreme because of the public and legal sanction given to their sexual abuse and exploitation by their owners. This is the first medal with the legend, Am I Not a Woman and Sister? It was produced by Thomas Halliday, a Birmingham, England engraver in 1834. British outreach included the hosting of the June 1840 convention of the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society. I mentioned this with the previous medal. The convention was attended by over 200 British delegates, 50 American, about a dozen French, and a few from other countries. Among the Americans were abolitionist newspaper editor William Lloyd Garrison, Lucretia Mott, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. When the London Committee voted to exclude women from the convention floor, Garrison, in protest, moved to the balcony where the women were seated. Maybe Garrison was a ladies' man. His move would draw much attention during the proceedings. The committee's exclusion of women would later have profound effect. Their exclusion from the floor galvanized the women. It was at this convention that Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton first met. They formed a friendship and alliance which would go beyond the abolition campaign to a crusade for women's rights and suffrage. In 1848, Mott and Stanton organized a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition of a woman. The Seneca Falls Convention was the origin of the women's suffrage movement. The American Anti-Slavery Society was formed in December 1833 with the goal of securing for Black Americans the rights and privileges that belong to them as men and as Americans. In 1838, the society membership was 300,000 and approximately 2,000 loosely affiliated chapters. They issued this token bearing a female slave in chains surrounded by the words, "Am I not a woman and sister?" These were actually first issued in 1837, contrary to the 1838 date on both the obverse and reverse, as evidenced by an advertisement published in the November 23, 1837 abolitionist newspaper, The Emancipator. The token contains a curious error in that the N of united is a mirror image. Eric Newman wrote that he believes recutting the die would have cost time and that the distribution had to be done immediately, or it might have been prevented by the enforcement of coinage law. There are also 4 known hard times tokens bearing the image of a male slave. I would like to introduce Elizabeth Margaret Chandler, a pioneer abolitionist who was credited by historians at the Daughters of the American Revolution Museum and the Yale Center for British Art as having first promoted the female kneeling slave image in the United States. Elizabeth was born to a Quaker family on Christmas Eve, 1807, and lost both her parents when she was only 9 years of age. When she was 18, she was awarded a prize for her poem, The Slave Ship. At 21, she was hired to edit the female repository page of the abolitionist newspaper, The Genius of Universal Emancipation. As editor, Chandler was in communication with women abolitionists from Britain. In the June 1830 edition of her column, excerpted here, reported the receipt from what she described our English friends of a seal bearing the device of a female kneeling slave and the motto, "Am I not a woman and sister?" The Clements Library, located in Ann Arbor, Michigan, today houses an archive of documents donated by Chandler's descendants. The curator of manuscripts for the library describes that family lore believed them to have belonged to Elizabeth Margaret Chandler. Certainly her 1830 published account of the receipt of the kneeling slave seal, as well as her contact with British abolitionists who first published the image in 1826, lends credence to this claim. I do note the image does not include the motto. Beginning in 1832, Chandler accepted the position as editor of the ladies' department for William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. This was in addition to her responsibility with the Genius of Universal Emancipation, which she continued. On January 29, 1832, the masthead for her column included the kneeling slave device. Note the similarity to the Hard Times token, which would be produced 6 years later. Elizabeth Margaret Chandler succumbed to remittent fever on November 2, 1834. Her role in the campaign to end slavery was widely recognized by her fellow abolitionists. 19 years later, William Lloyd Garrison made a pilgrimage to her gravesite. He reported that she had been entombed on a commanding elevation, selected by herself for that purpose, near the spot where she died. A neat white railing enclosing her, and some half a dozen young and thrifty oak trees standing in a row on one side. Chandler's grave is only about an hour from where I live. I recently paid a visit to this site. The railing is still maintained. The oaks are now ancient. The United States followed the path of Great Britain by outlawing the import of new African slaves, advocating the colonization of freed slaves, and the formation of anti-slavery societies. However, slavery proved difficult to defeat. The moral message of "Am I not a woman and a sister" tokens conflicted with the economic reality of slavery. By 1860, 4 million American slaves were worth some $3.5 billion, making them the largest single financial asset, excluding land, in the entire economy, worth more than all manufacturing assets and railroads combined. Abraham Lincoln is frequently considered the father of American emancipation. However, the forces which brought about the end of slavery were more complex than can be credited to Lincoln or any single person. Nevertheless, the story is best told by understanding the roles played by individuals. The history of abolition in the United States is also documented by medals and tokens and symbols on our coins, produced as the story unfolded. The pileus cap signified the emancipation of a slave in ancient times. This symbol also was used on several classic US coin designs. The significance of the symbol during the era of the original design of the coins can be seen in this painting titled "The Genius of America, Encouraging the Emancipation of the Blacks." It was created circa 1792. The pileus, or liberty cap, was a sensitive subject for slaveholders. In a March 3, 1825 letter from retired President Thomas Jefferson to Mint Director Samuel Moore, Jefferson wrote, "Surely the devices on our coins should be without the pileus, or we are not emancipated slaves." The icon of the liberty cap continued to fester with slaveholders. In 1855, then Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who was in charge of the construction of the Capitol dome, directed that the liberty cap on the originally designed statue above the dome be replaced with a Roman helmet, because in the words of Davis, the liberty cap is inappropriate to a people born free and should not be enslaved. When the American Anti-Slavery Society was formed in 1833, William Lloyd Garrison spoke before the Assembly in Philadelphia on December 6th and declared the opposition of moral purity to moral corruption, the destruction of error by the potency of truth, the overthrow of prejudice by the power of love, and the abolition of slavery by the spirit of repentance, words directly quoted on this medal. While the obverse has experienced some damage since it was produced in 1840, the sentiment engraved on the reverse has not. The maker of this piece, William Henry Bridges, would go on to be a prolific maker of Civil War tokens. Q. David Bowers covers him extensively, 13 pages, in his 2018 book, Engravers, Minters, and Distributors of Civil War Tokens. Slaveholding interests used various tactics to stifle anti-slavery voices. The gag rule was a parliamentary procedure where any Senate petition to restrict slavery was silenced with a motion to table, which was not debatable. While this practice ceased after 1850, Northern anti-slavery advocates would remember it for a long time. Abolitionists also considered it an attack on their free speech when anti-slavery newspapers and pamphlets mailed to Southern states were seized by local postmasters. The caning of Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner ratcheted the expression free speech from a rally cry to a battle cry. On May 20, 1856, Sumner delivered his crime against Kansas speech. Referring to South Carolina Senator Andrew Butler, he said, "The senator from South Carolina believes himself a chivalrous knight with sentiments of honor and courage. Of course, he has chosen a mistress to whom he has made his vows, and who, though ugly to others, is always lovely to him though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot, slavery. For her, his tongue is always profuse in words. Sumner's charge was personal. It was rumored that Butler had fathered children with a slave. Butler's cousin, Representative Preston Brooks, described his response. I struck him, Sumner, with my cane and gave him about 30 first-rate stripes. Every lick went where I intended. For about the first 5 or 6, he offered to make fight, but I plied him so rapidly that he did not touch me. Towards the last, he bellowed like a calf. Sumner was unable to slide out of his chair and was pinned under his desk, which was hinged to the floor. On May 24, 1856, Pittsburgh Gazette editorial protested, senators and representatives cannot enjoy the right of free speech or free discussion without being liable to brutal assaults, and they must of necessity arm themselves with sword canes or revolvers. This medal was struck with an obverse inscription, Massachusetts for justice, around an arm and a sword, and freedom of speech we never will surrender on the reverse. Those who read the legend, freedom of speech, would have been reminded by Massachusetts Senator Sumner's caning. Also, on May 24, 1856, abolitionist John Brown led a group, including his sons Frederick, Oliver, Owen, and Salmon, in the massacre with broadswords and firearms of 5 pro-slavery settlers at Pottawatomie Creek, Kansas. Brown's son, Salmon Brown, years later described that when they learned of the Sumner caning, Brown and his men went crazy. It seemed to be the finishing, decisive touch. On October 16, 1859, Brown led 18 others in a raid of the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He planned to confiscate firearms to be used in a slavery revolt. The next day, the U.S. Marines, commanded by Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart, retook the armory, capturing Brown and 6 other survivors. Brown was tried and convicted of treason, murder, and fomenting insurrection. He was hanged on December 2 of the same year. Ralph Waldo Emerson predicted John Brown would make the gallows as glorious as the cross. Henry David Thoreau proclaimed Brown a crucified hero. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote that the day of Brown's execution was the date of a new revolution, quite as much needed as the old one. Medals issued in copper, brass, and silver depicted Brown surrounded by the legend, slavery is the sum of all villainies. Northern intellectuals who supported Brown and this medal enraged the South even more than Brown's raid itself. This beautifully toned silver proof-like medal, the finest known, is in the collection of David Shankman. Surprisingly, I have not found any detailed analysis of the John Brown medal in numismatic publications. The most detailed account is an October 2, 1862 newspaper article offering to sell John Brown medals. It describes 19 shining stars above, representing the free states, and 15 dims below, representing the slave states, for a total of 34. The 34th state, Kansas, was admitted to the Union on January 29, 1861. It is reasonable to conclude that the medal was engraved after that date and before the October 1862 publication of this article describing it. The 15 dim stars include the 13 states which joined the Confederacy, as well as Maryland and Delaware, slave states which remained in the Union. During the election campaign of 1860, Lincoln secured the Republican nomination and the presidency by distancing himself from the radical Republicans who demanded immediate abolition of slavery. He staked his position as a moderate Republican, insisting only that slavery not be extended. Lincoln outlined his slavery position in his 1860 Cooper Union address. When he opposed the expansion of slavery to the Western territories, but then stated, wrong as we think slavery is, we can yet afford to let it alone where it is. That much is due to the necessity arising from its actual presence in the nation. The reverse legend, Let Liberty Be National and Slavery Sectional, summarizes this position. It might be asked, if Lincoln's position was so accommodating, why did the Southern states secede? Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis, prior to secession, declared a constitutional right to take property, including slave property, into the common territories, which could not be nullified by the Congress or territorial governments. The position of the South was the opposite of the legend on this medal, that slavery was national. During the Civil War, a shortage of circulating coins resulted when specie payments were suspended on currency issued to finance the war. Gold and silver coins were then worth more than currency, and so rarely circulated. Since there were not enough government-issued copper and nickel coins to make up for the hoarded gold and silver, base metal tokens were produced in quantity by private makers to fill the shortage. Some contain the legend stating that the purpose of the war was to protect the Union. The federal Union must be preserved was known to all as a quote from slaveholding President Andrew Jackson, who directed it to John C. Calhoun during the threat of an earlier secession. During the 1832 nullification crisis, Jackson sought to protect the Union when tariffs threatened to split it apart. Tariffs continued as a source of disagreement, but were not mentioned by any state in their declaration of secession. What now split the Union was slavery. Here it is important to distinguish between the cause of the war, slavery, and the initial purpose, preservation of the Union. As casualties mounted, so did pressure from the abolitionist faction to redefine that purpose. Some Civil War tokens bear the legend, liberty and no slavery. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that as of January 1, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, then in rebellion against the United States, shall be then and forever free. Campaign medals for the 1864 election document that the cause of the war, slavery, had now resulted in a new and complementary purpose, the abolition of slavery. This is nowhere more clearly stated than on this medal, which proclaims, if I am re-elected president, slavery must be abolished with the reunion of states. Unlike legends struck on medals issued for Lincoln's 1860 campaign, the meaning of these words needs little historical context. There are some objects which are more fit for a national museum than a private collection. One is the Civil War identification disc, known as a dog tag, of Sergeant Qualls Tibbs of the 27th Colored Infantry, now curated in the collection of the Smithsonian. Civil War dog tags were procured by individual soldiers as they contemplated the possibility of burial in a mass grave without notice to their parents, wives, or children. They were purchased from sutlers, merchants, who traveled with military units and sold provisions to soldiers from a wagon or tent. The variety pictured here is a blank obverse and reverse, and is described as an extremely rare double blank. The letters 27 USCT and Qualls Tibbs have been individually hand punched. Qualls Tibbs was born on March 3, 1836 in Orange County, Virginia, to freed slave Matilda Tibbs. She relocated her family to Ohio in 1848. Qualls was 27 years old when he enlisted in Company E, 27th Regiment, U.S. Colored Infantry. February 10, 1865, at the Battle of Wilmington, North Carolina, he took a bullet to his right shoulder. Tibbs did survive that wound. However, more than 40,000 African-American soldiers did pay the ultimate price for their country and their journey towards emancipation. On the day that Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, there were more African-American soldiers fighting for the Union than the total of all Confederate forces. These men answered the challenge of former slave Frederick Douglass, who recruited Black soldiers by calling, "Who would be free themselves must strike the first blow. I urge you to fly to arms and smite to death the power that would bury the government and your liberty in the same hopeless grave." The words of Douglass and the actions of Black soldiers stand in contrast to the kneeling supplicant slave. The end of the slave trade and the abolition of slavery began while Equiano demonstrated to British abolitionists that he was a man and a brother. The first artistic medals deployed in support of this effort were part of a broad moral campaign. The last utilitarian tokens were part of the appeal to arms, which was the Civil War. This appeal was answered by men like Qualls Tibbs. The chains of slavery were finally severed after 600,000 gave their last full measure of devotion. On December 18, 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, declaring that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. That is the end of my slides. And I would be happy, if I can figure out how to stop share here. There it is.
All right. Thanks a lot, Ernie. We got a number of questions here. First one, I recently acquired the 1833 Colonization Society Liberia token. My understanding is that the Colonization Society was opposed to abolitionists as an effort to remove free Blacks from the US and actually to preserve slavery as an institution. While the Am I Not a Sister token is included in the Hard Times tokens, should the Liberia token also be included in the Hard Times tokens?
Well, a couple things there. Most of the people, of the individuals in the United States and really in Great Britain who ended up as abolitionists started as proponents of colonization. And there was a significant rift in 1833 where William Lloyd Garrison split off from other abolitionists, in part because, or not other abolitionists, but other anti-slavery individuals, because Garrison was opposed to colonization, while many still continued to support colonization. So it's, Lincoln was in favor of colonization right up through, maybe 1864, and others. With regard to the token, yeah, I think it should be included as a Hard Times token. I mean, it was made by Hard Times token manufacturer in that era. pretty important piece. I think, was there 6 varieties? There's a large ship and a small ship, and then various varieties based on the number of palm leaves and things like that. So it's an important token. Should be a hard times token.
Okay, we've got another question. You mentioned the FCC Boyd collection of anti-slavery medals and tokens.
Yes.
At what point did the collection of anti-slavery medals and tokens become a collecting discipline that was practiced? I mean, were people in the 19th century making collections of these things?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure a lot of British medal collectors would have collected them, the British medals. Although I haven't run across any book. Ben Weiss published a book in 2020 about anti-slavery and medals and tokens. But I don't think there are many other dedicated books. There's some pretty extensive articles. George Fold in the 1950s wrote a pretty extensive article about anti-slavery tokens. And there are other articles, but not many books dedicated to the subject.
And typically you see a collection formed and then the article or the book comes after that.
Right.
Sure. All right. Any other questions out there? We'll just give it a minute. Do also want to remind our viewers that at 11:30 Eastern, we'll be doing a session on the National Numismatic Collection. We'll have the curators on hand and also be showing a new video on that important collection. All right, any other questions out there? All right.
Good. Thanks
Ernie,
a
I
lot.
think that'll wrap it up. Thank you so much. And we'll see everyone on the subsequent sessions today and through Sunday. Thanks a lot, Ernie.
Bye.